A terminally ill millionaire invited a poor girl to live in his mansion, hoping to find meaning in his final days. His wife's strange behavior and sudden hostility toward the child raised suspicions, but nothing could prepare him for what he discovered in his investigation. When the truth about his wife's past came to light, it shattered everything he thought he knew. What happened next is even more shocking. Leave a like to keep following the upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more incredible stories like this. Richard Mitchell stood at the window of his study, watching raindrops trail down the glass while clutching the medical report that had shattered his world. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live at best. The irony wasn't lost on him. All his wealth, his sprawling mansion in Connecticut, his successful investment firm, none of it could buy him more time. At 62, he had everything money could buy, and nothing that truly mattered. The empty halls of his mansion echoed with each step, a constant reminder of his solitude. His wife Claire moved through the house like a ghost, barely speaking to him anymore, lost in her own world of charity galas and social events. That rainy Tuesday morning, Richard decided to take a different route to his office. He didn't know what compelled him to drive through the poorer side of town. Perhaps a subconscious desire to remind himself that things could be worse. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled under a store awning, soaked to the bone despite seeking shelter from the rain. She couldn't have been more than 12, wearing clothes that had seen better days, clutching a worn backpack to her chest. Something about her caught his attention. Not just her obvious poverty, but the way she held herself, dignity intact despite her circumstances. Richard pulled his car over, ignoring the angry honks from vehicles behind him. He grabbed his umbrella and stepped out into the rain. As he approached, the girl looked up, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "Are you all right?" he asked, holding the umbrella over her. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice stronger than he expected. "You don't need to worry about me. Where are your parents?" A flash of pain crossed her face before she masked it. "Mom's sick. Dad's not around." Richard learned her name was Emily, and she was supposed to be in school, but couldn't go because her shoes had fallen apart. Her mother had been too sick to work for months, and they'd been evicted from their apartment 2 weeks ago. They were staying with a neighbor, but it was temporary. Despite her circumstances, Emily spoke with remarkable clarity and maturity. She didn't beg or complain. She simply stated facts, as if reading from a weather report. It struck Richard how someone so young could be so composed in the face of such hardship. "Let me help," he found himself saying. "I can at least buy you some new shoes." Emily's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Because I can. Because maybe helping you might actually help me too." She studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "My mom always said not to trust strangers, but she also said to trust my instincts. You seem sad, like you need this more than I do." Her insight startled him. This child, with nothing to her name, had seen right through his expensive suit and carefully maintained facade to the emptiness beneath. That afternoon, after buying Emily new shoes and proper rain gear, Richard met her mother, Sarah. They were staying in a cramped one-room apartment with a kind, elderly neighbor. Sarah was thin and pale, clearly ill, but her eyes held the same intelligence as her daughter's. She listened quietly as Richard explained who he was and how he'd met Emily. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "I have a large house, more room than I know what to do with. Let me help you both. Emily can have her own room, continue her schooling, and Sarah, I can ensure you get proper medical care." "Why?" Sarah asked, the same question her daughter had posed earlier. "What do you want in return?" Richard thought about the cancer diagnosis burning a hole in his pocket, about his hollow mansion and distant wife, about the strange connection he felt to this child who seemed wise beyond her years. "Maybe I'm just tired of living in an empty house," he answered honestly. What he didn't expect was Claire's reaction when he brought Emily and Sarah home that evening. His wife took one look at them and went pale, as if she'd seen a ghost. She turned on her heel without a word and locked herself in their bedroom, refusing to come out. Richard had seen many sides of Claire in their 15 years of marriage, but never this. Her behavior was bizarre, almost frightened. When she finally emerged hours later, her face was a mask of forced composure. "They can't stay here," she said flatly. "Claire, they have nowhere else to go. Sarah needs medical care, and Emily—" "I said no!" Claire's voice rose to nearly a shriek. "Get them out! Get them out now!" Richard stared at his wife, shocked by her uncharacteristic outburst. Claire was usually the perfect society wife, controlled, polite, never raising her voice. But something about Emily and Sarah had cracked that careful veneer, revealing something darker underneath. Looking at Claire's wild eyes and trembling hands, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple act of charity. His wife's extreme reaction to Emily stirred questions he had never thought to ask before about her past, about the years before they met. What he didn't know then was that his decision to help Emily would unravel a web of secrets that had been carefully maintained for over a decade. As he stood there watching his wife's retreating back, Richard had no idea that he had just set in motion events that would expose truths that would shake their lives to the core. Despite Claire's protests, Richard stood firm. He moved Emily and Sarah into the east wing of the mansion, far from the master bedroom. Sarah's condition was worse than he'd initially thought. Years of inadequate medical care had taken their toll. He immediately arranged for the best doctors to examine her, while Emily settled into her new surroundings with remarkable adaptability. Claire's behavior became increasingly erratic. She refused to eat meals if Emily was present at the table. She would take long, meandering drives, returning late at night with no explanation. When she was home, she spent hours on the phone in whispered conversations that abruptly ended whenever Richard entered the room. One afternoon, Richard was working in his study when he heard voices from the garden. Through the window, he saw Emily helping Margaret, their elderly gardener, with the roses. The girl had a natural way with the flowers, handling them with gentle care. "My mom taught me about gardening," Emily explained when Margaret commented on her skill. "She said her mother used to have a beautiful garden before—" Emily trailed off, her expression clouding over. Richard noticed she often did this, starting to share something about her family's past, then catching herself, as if remembering she wasn't supposed to talk about it. Later that evening, Richard found Claire in their bedroom, hastily shoving something into her dresser drawer when he entered. Her makeup was smeared, evidence of recent tears. "We need to talk about Emily," Richard said, closing the door behind him. "There's nothing to talk about," Claire snapped, but her hands were trembling. "Your behavior since they arrived has been bizarre, Claire. You barely leave your room, you won't look at Emily, and now these secret phone calls. What's going on?" Claire turned to face him, her expression hard. "Did it ever occur to you to ask me before bringing strangers into our home? Did you even think about what this might mean for me? They needed help, Claire. Sarah is seriously ill." "Sarah?" Claire's voice cracked on the name. "Is that what she's calling herself now?" Richard froze. "What do you mean, calling herself now?" But Claire had already caught herself, her face closing off. "Nothing. I'm tired, Richard. I'm going to bed." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Claire's slip about Sarah's name kept replaying in his mind. He got up and went to his study, turning on his computer. He began searching through old social registers, charity event photos, anything that might give him a clue about Claire's past. Hours passed as he dug deeper. Claire had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a prominent family. She'd attended private schools, made her debut in society at 18, and then nothing. There was a gap in her history, nearly 5 years where she seemed to vanish from the social scene entirely. She reappeared at age 23, shortly before meeting Richard. What had happened during those missing years? A soft knock at the door interrupted his research. It was Emily, in pajamas too large for her thin frame. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "I saw your light on." Richard gestured for her to come in. She curled up in one of the leather chairs, looking small and vulnerable in the dim light. "Your wife doesn't like us being here," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Claire is complicated," Richard replied carefully. Emily nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Mum gets this look sometimes when she thinks I'm not watching. Like she's carrying something really heavy that she can't put down. Your wife has that same look." Richard studied Emily's face. There was something in her features, something he couldn't quite place, but that nagged at his memory. "Emily, what do you remember about your early childhood, before you and your mom struggled?" The girl's face scrunched in concentration. "Not much. Mom says we moved around a lot when I was little. I remember a house with blue shutters and a garden, but it feels more like a dream than a memory." She yawned, her eyes growing heavy. Richard helped her back to her room, but his mind was racing. A house with blue shutters. He remembered something from his research into Claire's family. Their summer home in Cape Cod had blue shutters, and Claire's mother had been famous for her garden parties there. The next morning, Richard drove to his office early, before Claire woke up. He had connections, people who could dig deeper than a simple internet search. He called in favors, asking for detailed background checks on both Claire's past and Sarah's history. What he didn't know was that Claire was making calls of her own. From her car parked at the end of their long driveway, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "James, it's me. We have a problem. They're here." "Yes, both of them. I don't know how, but they found me. You said this would never happen. You promised me." Claire's voice cracked with panic. She didn't notice the figure watching from behind a tree, Emily, who had risen early to help Margaret with the gardens. The girl stood perfectly still, listening to Claire's half of the conversation, her young face set in an expression far too serious for her years. Back in his office, Richard stared at the preliminary report his investigator had just delivered. According to official records, Sarah Matthews didn't exist before 12 years ago. There was no birth certificate, no school records, nothing to trace her life before she appeared in their city with a young Emily. It was as if she had emerged from thin air or assumed a completely new identity. Sarah's condition worsened rapidly over the next few days. The doctors discovered her flu was actually advanced pneumonia, complicated by years of untreated chronic illness. They admitted her to the private hospital wing Richard had arranged, leaving Emily alone at the mansion more often. During these days, Richard noticed Emily watching Claire when his wife wasn't looking. The girl's gaze was intense, studying, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Sometimes he caught Claire doing the same thing, stealing glances at Emily when she thought no one would notice, her expression a mix of fear and something else, longing. One morning, Richard entered his study to find Emily standing before the large portrait of Claire that hung over the fireplace. She didn't turn when he entered, too absorbed in studying the painting. "Your wife has the same eyes as my mum," Emily said quietly. "People always said I have my mum's eyes, but looking at this painting..." She trailed off, but Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He'd never noticed before, but Emily was right. They had the same unusual shade of grey-green eyes, almost silver in certain lights. The same eyes that had first attracted him to Claire 15 years ago. Later that day, Richard visited Sarah in the hospital. She was sleeping when he arrived, her face gaunt against the white pillows. On her bedside table sat a small, worn photo album. Richard hesitated, then picked it up, telling himself he was just trying to understand. The first few pages showed Emily as a toddler, but something seemed off about the photos. They were all taken indoors, no backgrounds visible, no birthday parties, no park visits, no normal childhood moments, just carefully staged shots that could have been taken anywhere. A nurse entered, startling him. He nearly dropped the album, and a loose photo slipped out, falling to the floor. When he picked it up, his hands began to shake. It was older than the others, worn and creased, showing a teenage girl standing in front of a house with blue shutters. She was smiling, one hand resting on a rose bush. The girl was Claire. Richard pocketed the photo before Sarah could wake up. His mind was spinning. Why would Sarah have a photo of Claire as a teenager? The same house Emily remembered from her early childhood, Claire's family summer home. Back at the mansion, he found Claire in their bedroom, packing a suitcase. "Going somewhere?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "I need some time away," she replied without looking at him. "This situation, I can't handle it." "What situation exactly?" Richard pulled out the photo and placed it on the bed. "Maybe we should talk about this." Claire went completely still. "Where did you get that?" "From Sarah's photo album." "Want to tell me why she has a picture of you from 20 years ago?" The color drained from Claire's face. She sank onto the bed, her legs seemingly unable to hold her. "You don't understand. You can't understand." "Then help me understand, Claire, because right now I'm looking at a 12-year-old girl who has your eyes, finding photographs that make no sense and watching my wife fall apart. What aren't you telling me?" Claire's hands twisted in her lap. "I can't. If I tell you, people will get hurt." "People are already hurting," Richard said quietly. "Sarah is critically ill in the hospital. Emily has spent her life in poverty, and you're haunted by something you won't share with your own husband." Tears began rolling down Claire's cheeks. "I never meant it wasn't supposed to be like this. James said he would take care of everything." "Who's James?" But Claire clammed up again, shaking her head violently. "No, no more questions. I'm leaving tonight. Don't try to stop me." She grabbed her suitcase and practically ran from the room. Richard heard her car start moments later, tires crunching on the gravel driveway as she fled. He sat heavily in an armchair, the photograph seeming to burn a hole in his pocket. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and called his investigator. "I need everything you can find on a man named James, who would have been in Claire's life during those missing years," he said. "And I mean everything." That evening, he found Emily in the garden, carefully tending to a rose bush that hadn't bloomed in years. "Mom's doing better," she said without looking up. "The doctors say she might be able to come home next week." Richard noticed she didn't say home with any conviction, as if she wasn't sure where that was anymore. He sat on a nearby bench, watching her small hands work with surprising skill. "Emily, can I ask you something? Has your mom ever mentioned someone named James?" The girl's hands stilled. When she turned to face him, her expression was guarded. "Once, I heard her talking in her sleep. She was saying, 'James promised. James said he would fix it.'" She was crying. Richard felt his chest tighten, the same name Claire had mentioned. "Did you ever meet this James?" Emily shook her head, but she hesitated, then continued. "Sometimes when we first moved to a new place, Mom would get really scared. She'd make us hide in the bathroom for hours. She said it was a game, but I knew she was watching for someone through the window." Richard's phone buzzed, a message from his investigator. He opened it, read the first few lines, and felt his blood run cold. James Blackwood, former lawyer, disbarred 15 years ago for ethical violations, specialized in private adoptions and identity changes, known connections to several cases of questionable custody arrangements, current whereabouts unknown. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that made Richard's stomach turn, but he still didn't have the full image, and he had a feeling the truth would be worse than anything he could imagine. Claire had been gone for 3 days when Richard received another report from his investigator. He was in his study, watching Emily read in the window seat, a habit she'd developed since Sarah had been hospitalized. The girl had an uncanny way of finding patches of sunlight around the mansion, like a cat seeking warmth. The email contained old newspaper clippings about James Blackwood. One headline caught Richard's eye: "Prominent lawyer accused of arranging illegal adoptions." The article was from 15 years ago, right around the time Claire had disappeared from Boston's social scene. According to the article, Blackwood had specialized in helping wealthy families resolve unwanted pregnancies by arranging for the children to be adopted, often through questionable means. He'd lost his license when one such arrangement went wrong, but the details were frustratingly vague. "Your wife is back," Emily said suddenly, not looking up from her book. Richard glanced out the window. Sure enough, Claire's car was pulling into the driveway. She looked disheveled, her normally perfect appearance showing signs of strain. As she stepped out of the car, Richard noticed she was carrying a thick manila envelope. "Stay here," he told Emily. But when he turned back, the window seat was empty. The girl moved like a ghost sometimes, appearing and disappearing at will. He found Claire in their bedroom, hands shaking as she tried to unlock her jewelry box. "Where have you been?" he asked from the doorway. She jumped, the box falling to the floor. The envelope she'd been carrying slipped from under her arm, spilling photographs across the carpet. Richard moved to help her collect them, but froze when he saw what they showed. They were surveillance photos, clearly taken with a long lens. Photos of Sarah and Emily over the years, outside various apartment buildings, walking to school, at bus stops. The most recent ones showed them outside the mansion. On the back of each photo was a date and a large red X. "Someone's been watching them," Richard said slowly. "All this time." Claire's face crumpled. "James wouldn't stop. He said he had to make sure, had to be certain they never..." "Never what, Claire? What are you so afraid they'll reveal?" Before she could answer, a small gasp came from the doorway. Emily stood there, one of the fallen photographs in her hand. It showed a much younger Sarah holding a baby, standing in front of that same blue-shuttered house from Claire's old photo. "Mom said this house burned down," Emily whispered. "She said that's why we don't have any old pictures. But here it is." Claire made a sound like she'd been struck. She lunged for the photo, but Emily darted away with the quickness of someone used to evading adults. The girl's eyes were wide, moving between Claire and the photograph. "Why do you have pictures of us?" Emily demanded. "Why have you been watching us?" "Emily, please." Claire's voice was barely audible. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to us," Richard cut in. "Both of us, right now." But Claire backed away, shaking her head. "I can't. James said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure. He promised he'd take care of everything if I just stayed quiet." "James Blackwood?" Richard pressed. "The disbarred lawyer who specialized in making babies disappear." Claire went deathly pale. In that moment, Emily stepped forward, her young face set in an expression far too old for her years. "Mom told me once, when she was very sick and thought I was sleeping," Emily said quietly. "She said my real mother was young and scared, and someone named James promised to help her, but instead he threatened to hurt people if my mum didn't take me away." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the truth written in every line of her trembling body. "You were the young mother," he said softly. "Emily is your daughter." Claire sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "I was 19. My family. They said it would ruin everything. James said he'd handle it, make it all go away. He found Sarah. She was desperate for money, willing to disappear with a new identity. He promised me Emily would have a good life. But he lied." Emily's voice was steady, though her hands shook. "He took Mum's money and left us with nothing. She got sick working 3 jobs to take care of me, all this time." A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Sarah stood there, leaning heavily against the door frame. She must have checked herself out of the hospital somehow. "I couldn't let you keep lying to her," Sarah said to Claire, her voice weak but determined. "Not after seeing this house, realizing who you were. Emily deserves to know her mother." Claire let out a sob. I gave up that right. I let James convince me. I was so young and stupid." "You were manipulated," Richard said, understanding flooding through him. "By your family, by James. But Emily paid the price, both Emily and Sarah. But there was something in Sarah's expression, a tension, a fear, that suggested they still didn't have the whole truth." She clutched the doorframe tighter, swaying slightly. "James," she whispered. "He's been calling, threatening. He says he's coming to fix his mistake, to make sure everyone keeps their promises." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. In that moment, looking at Sarah's terrified face and Claire's tears, he realized this was far from over. James Blackwood wasn't just a disgraced lawyer from the past. He was an active threat, and somehow Richard knew he was already on his way to their door. Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly after her unauthorized departure from the hospital. Richard arranged for private nurses to care for her in the mansion, but the damage was done. Her fever spiked dangerously high that night, and in her delirium, she began to talk. "He's coming," she muttered, tossing restlessly in her bed. "James is coming to finish it. The money. He wants the money." Emily refused to leave her mother's side, holding her hand through the worst of the fever. Claire hovered in doorways, watching them with a haunted expression, but never entering the room. Richard split his time between making urgent phone calls and trying to piece together the fragments of truth emerging from Sarah's feverish ramblings. "What money is she talking about?" he asked Claire late that night, after Emily had finally fallen asleep in the chair beside Sarah's bed. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, staring out the window into the darkness. "When I was pregnant, my family set up a trust fund. A lot of money meant to ensure the baby would be taken care of after the adoption. James was supposed to manage it. But Sarah never saw that money, did she?" "No," Claire whispered. "James said there were complications, that the money had to be used for new identities, for keeping people quiet. I was so scared, I never questioned it." A crack of thunder made them both jump. A storm was rolling in, dark clouds obscuring the moon. In the dim light, Claire looked ghostly, almost transparent. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain, now hitting the windows. "Something Sarah knows. James called me last week when you first brought them here. He said she has proof, documents that could destroy everything. That's why he's coming." As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across the driveway. A black car pulled up to the mansion, its engine cutting off with an ominous finality. Richard moved to the window, watching as a tall figure emerged from the driver's side. "Stay here," he told Claire, but she grabbed his arm. "You don't understand. James isn't just some corrupt lawyer. He's dangerous. The things he did, the people he worked with." The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the quiet house. Richard gently removed Claire's hand from his arm. "It's time we face this, Claire. All of it." He made his way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the frosted glass panels beside the door, he could see the distorted outline of a man waiting. Thunder crashed again as Richard opened the door. James Blackwood had aged since the newspaper photos, his hair now more grey than black, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Mr. Mitchell," he said smoothly, "I apologize for the late hour, but we have urgent matters to discuss." "Do we?" Richard's voice was cold. "Like the trust fund you stole? Or the lives you destroyed?" James' smile didn't waver. Now, everything I did was strictly legal. Well, mostly legal. May I come in? This rain is rather unpleasant." Before Richard could respond, a small voice came from the stairs. "You're the man from the photos." Emily stood halfway down the staircase, her face hard in the dim light. James's smile faltered for the first time. "Ah, the young lady herself. My, how you've grown. You look just like your mother. Your real mother, that is." "Emily, go back upstairs," Richard said, but the girl didn't move. "You hurt my mum," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Sarah, the only real mother I've ever had. She got sick because of you." James's expression darkened. "Children should be seen and not heard. The adults need to talk now." "No." Emily's voice grew stronger. "I heard Mom talking to the nurses. She told them everything. About the papers she kept, proving what you did. Not just to us, but to other families too." For the first time, James looked unsettled. "What papers?" "Emily." Claire's voice came from the top of the stairs. She looked terrified, but she was moving down toward her daughter. "Please, go back to your room." "Listen to Mrs. Mitchell," James said, his smooth tone taking on an edge. "This is all just a misunderstanding that we're going to sort out quietly." But Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "Mom gave these to me before she got sick. She said if anything happened to her, I should show them to the police." James moved so fast that Richard barely had time to react. He lunged for the stairs, reaching for Emily, but Claire was faster. She threw herself between them, shielding her daughter. "Don't you dare touch her!" Claire screamed, all her fear transforming into rage. "You've taken enough from us!" Richard grabbed James from behind, pulling him back from the stairs. In the struggle, Emily dropped the envelope, papers spilling across the floor. James broke free, diving for them, but froze when he saw what they actually were. They weren't legal documents at all. They were letters, dozens of them written in Claire's distinctive handwriting, dated from 15 years ago. Letters to her unborn child, explaining why she was being forced to give her up. Letters that proved she had been coerced, that exposed the web of lies and manipulation James had woven. And among them was one final document, a bank statement showing exactly where the trust fund money had really gone. Thunder crashed outside as James stared at the papers scattered across the floor. His composed facade cracked, revealing something ugly underneath. The bank statement showed regular transfers to offshore accounts, millions of dollars that should have gone to Emily's care, systematically stolen over 15 years. "You don't understand," James said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "That money was compensation, payment for keeping certain people quiet, for maintaining the story. Your family's reputation was at stake, Claire. Everything I did was to protect you." "Protect me?" Claire's voice shook with rage. "You destroyed lives. Sarah nearly died working herself to exhaustion to care for my daughter, while you lived off money meant for Emily's future." A sudden commotion from upstairs made them all turn. One of the nurses appeared at the top of the stairs, her face grave. "Mr. Mitchell, it's Sarah. She's crashing. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Emily's face went white. She tried to run up the stairs, but James grabbed her arm. "No one is going anywhere until we sort this out. Those papers need to disappear." Richard moved without thinking, driven by a fury he'd never known himself capable of. He slammed James against the wall, pinning him there. "Emily," he said calmly, despite the rage coursing through him, "go to your mother. Claire, call 911 and the police." James laughed, a hollow sound. "The police? And tell them what? That Claire abandoned her baby, that she paid me to make her daughter disappear. How do you think that will look in the papers, Richard? Prominent businessman's wife in baby-selling scandal. Your reputation will be ruined." "I don't care about reputations anymore," Richard said quietly. "I'm dying, James. Cancer. I have months left at best, but I'm going to spend every day I have left making sure you pay for what you've done." The sound of sirens in the distance made James struggle harder. "You're making a mistake. I have connections, people who won't want this story getting out. Important people who used my services over the years." "You mean other families you destroyed?" Claire was gathering the papers from the floor, her hands shaking but determined. "Other babies you sold, other lives you ruined for profit?" Paramedics burst through the front door, rushing upstairs to Sarah. Emily's terrified voice floated down. "Mum! Mum! Please wake up!" The sound seemed to break something in Claire. She looked at the letters in her hands. 15 years of guilt and love and regret poured onto paper, written to a daughter she'd been too afraid to keep. "I'm going with them," she said, moving toward the stairs. "She's my daughter and Sarah. Sarah gave her everything I was too cowardly to give. She deserves to know I'm here now." James made one last attempt to break free, but Richard held firm. "Think about what you're doing," he hissed. "Once this gets out, it won't just be me going down. Everyone involved will face questions, including Claire's family, including you, Richard. Your perfect life will be over." "My perfect life?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Look around you, James. Look what your perfect lies have cost everyone. A girl grew up in poverty while you stole her future. A woman worked herself to death caring for a child she protected at all costs. My wife spent 15 years drowning in guilt and fear. There's nothing perfect about any of it. Police cars were pulling up now, their lights painting the walls in alternating red and blue. James seemed to deflate, the fight leaving him as officers entered the house. Upstairs, the paramedics were rushing Sarah out on a stretcher, Emily clutching her hand, Claire following close behind. As they passed, Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on Claire. "I kept them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All the letters you wrote her. Every birthday, every Christmas. I made sure she knew her mother loved her, even if she couldn't be there." Claire's sob echoed through the foyer as Sarah was wheeled out to the ambulance. Emily stood frozen on the stairs, looking lost, until Claire held out her hand. "Come with me," she said softly. "Please, I know I don't deserve it, but let me be there for you now. Let me help Sarah. Let me try to make something right." Emily looked at her biological mother, then at Richard, who was watching the police handcuff James. Can Richard come too?" "Of course I'm coming," Richard said, moving toward them once James was secured. "We're all going, together." As they headed for the door, following the ambulance's flashing lights into the rainy night, one of the police officers called out, "Sir, we'll need statements from everyone. This is looking like a major fraud case." "Tomorrow," Richard said firmly. "Right now, we need to be with our family." The word family hung in the air, broken and healing, wounded and hopeful. As they drove through the storm toward the hospital, Richard glanced in the rearview mirror at Emily, sandwiched between himself and Claire in the back of the police car they'd been offered. She looked so small, yet so strong, just like her mother, both of her mothers. And despite everything, despite the pain and lies and years of separation, they were finally, impossibly, finding their way back to each other. The hospital waiting room felt like a liminal space, suspended between what was and what would be. Richard sat between Claire and Emily, watching the seconds tick by on the wall clock. Sarah had been in emergency surgery for 3 hours. Her pneumonia had developed into sepsis, the doctor said. The next 24 hours would be critical. Emily hadn't spoken since they arrived. She sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap, staring at the emergency room doors as if she could will them to open with good news. Claire kept reaching toward her, then pulling back, unsure of her place in this moment of crisis. "She's strong," Richard said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "Sarah's a fighter. She's been fighting her whole life." Emily nodded slightly but didn't turn away from the doors. "She used to tell me that sometimes God gives you the family you're born with, and sometimes He gives you the family you need. I never understood what she meant until now." Claire made a small, choked sound. Emily finally turned to look at her biological mother, her young face serious and wise beyond her years. "She never let me hate you," Emily said softly. "Even when things were really bad, when we didn't have enough to eat, or when we had to sleep in shelters, she would show me your letters. She said you were young and scared, and that giving me to her was an act of love, even if it didn't feel like it." Tears streamed down Claire's face. "I wanted to find you. So many times I almost... But James said if I tried, he would tell everyone what happened. My family would have been ruined. I was a coward." "You were a victim too," Richard said, taking her hand. "James manipulated everyone. He took advantage of a scared teenager and a desperate woman, all for money." A doctor emerged from the emergency room and they all stood. His face was tired but not grave, a good sign Richard had learned over years of business negotiations. Reading people's expressions had become second nature. "Mrs. Matthews is stable," the doctor said. "The surgery went well, but she's very weak. The next few hours are crucial. She's asking for Emily." Emily hesitated, looking at Claire and Richard. "Can they come too?" The doctor nodded, briefly. "She needs rest, but a short visit should be okay." Sarah lay pale against the white hospital sheets, tubes and monitors surrounding her like a technological cocoon. Despite her condition, her eyes were clear and alert when they entered. She tried to smile when she saw Emily. Then her gaze moved to Claire and Richard. "You're still here," she whispered. "All of you." "We're not going anywhere," Richard said firmly. "You're family now. All of us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to bring her to you so many times, Claire, but James, he threatened to hurt her if I did. Said he'd make sure no one ever found us." "I know." Claire moved closer to the bed. "I understand now. You did everything I couldn't. You loved her when I was too afraid to." "She made it easy to love her." Sarah's voice was getting weaker. "She's so much like you. Strong, even when she's scared. Smart. Kind." Emily crawled carefully onto the bed, curling up next to Sarah like she had done countless times before. "I love you, Mom," she said fiercely. "You're my real mom, no matter what." Sarah stroked Emily's hair with a shaking hand. "You're lucky, sweetheart. Now you have two mothers who love you. And Richard." She turned her head slightly to look at him. "Thank you for seeing what was right in front of you, for bringing us here." Richard felt his chest tighten. He thought about his cancer diagnosis, still a secret from everyone except his doctors, about how finding Emily and Sarah had given him a purpose in his final months, about how sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most beautiful transformations. "I should be thanking you," he said. "Both of you. You've shown me what real courage looks like." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Matthews needs to rest now." Emily clung tighter to Sarah. "I want to stay." "Let her stay," Sarah whispered. "Please, she's been my strength all these years. I need her now." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but just Emily. The rest of you can come back in a few hours." As they left the room, Richard saw Emily taking out a worn book, the same one she'd been reading in his study. She opened it and began to read softly to Sarah, her voice steady and soothing. In the hallway, Claire collapsed against Richard, finally letting out the sobs she'd been holding back. "What do we do now?" she asked between breaths. "How do we fix this?" Richard held her, watching through the window as Emily read to the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. "We can't fix the past," he said gently, "but we can build something new, something honest." Sarah gave Emily roots. Now it's our turn to give them both wings. A text message buzzed on his phone. It was from his lawyer. "James is talking. Multiple families involved. This goes deeper than we thought. How do you want to proceed?" Richard looked at the message, then at his wife, then at the two figures in the hospital room, the woman who had nothing but gave everything, and the girl who had unknowingly brought them all together. He knew what he had to do. It wouldn't be easy and the fallout would be massive, but he owed it to all of them to see this through, to make sure justice was served, no matter the cost to reputations or fortunes. The truth, he had learned, was worth any price. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Richard sat in his study, watching the news coverage unfold on multiple channels. "Prominent lawyer arrested in baby trafficking scandal" scrolled across the bottom of every screen. James's face, now haggard after a week in custody, stared back from newspapers and websites. Claire's family had already called 3 times, leaving increasingly frantic messages. They knew it was only a matter of time before their involvement came to light. Richard let the calls go to voicemail. His priority now was protecting Emily and Sarah. Sarah was recovering slowly but steadily. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, though she remained in intensive care. Emily split her time between the hospital and the mansion, where she had started to truly settle in, no longer walking on eggshells or hiding in corners. A knock at the study door pulled Richard from his thoughts. Detective Laura Martinez stood there, her expression grave. "We need to talk," she said, entering and closing the door behind her. "James Blackwood is offering to name names in exchange for leniency. The list? It's longer than we imagined." Richard gestured for her to sit. "How many families?" 23 that we've confirmed so far, spanning 15 years, prominent families, all of them. He approached young women from wealthy backgrounds who had gotten pregnant at inconvenient times, offered to make their problems disappear. Then he'd find desperate people willing to take the babies, charge them exorbitant fees, and pocket the trust funds meant for the children. Richard felt sick. And Sarah? Where does she fit in? Detective Martinez opened her notebook. Sarah Matthews, real name Sarah Connor, was a nurse at Boston General. She discovered what James was doing when one of his arrangements went wrong. A baby died due to inadequate medical care. She threatened to expose him. So he threatened her instead, Richard concluded. Not just threatened, he gave her a choice. Take Claire's baby and disappear, or he'd make sure she disappeared permanently. She chose to run, to protect both herself and Emily. The trust fund that was supposed to follow them, he kept every penny. Richard's hands clenched into fists. And my wife's family? Were they aware of his methods? They knew enough, Martinez said carefully. They paid him well to keep their reputation intact, but they didn't know about the other families or what happened to the money. James was clever. He kept everyone in separate boxes, using each person's secrets to control the others. A soft sound made them both turn. Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "I want to testify," she said quietly, "against James, against all of them." "Emily," Richard started, but she cut him off. "I remember more than Mom thinks I do. The times we had to run in the middle of the night, the men who would follow us sometimes, the way she would cry when she thought I was sleeping. I want to tell everyone what they did to us." Detective Martinez studied the girl thoughtfully. "Your testimony could be very powerful, but it would mean publicity, exposure. Your life would change completely." "My life already changed," Emily said with a wisdom far beyond her 12 years. "The truth is already out there. At least this way, it can help other families like us." Richard felt a surge of pride mixed with deep sadness. Emily had been forced to grow up too fast, to understand things no child should have to comprehend. Yet here she was, still choosing to be brave. "There's something else," Martinez said, turning back to Richard. "We found evidence that James was still actively arranging adoptions up until his arrest. There are 3 pregnant teenagers right now, all from wealthy families, all expecting to use his services in the coming months." Richard stood, moving to the window. His reflection looked tired, the cancer taking its toll despite his efforts to hide it. But his voice was firm when he spoke. "I want to help them, all of them. The mothers, the babies, everyone affected by this. My lawyers are already setting up a foundation. We'll provide support, counseling, whatever they need to make real choices about their futures." "That's very generous," Martinez said carefully. "But it could be seen as an admission of involvement, your wife's connection to this case." "I don't care about appearances anymore," Richard interrupted. "I care about doing what's right. For too long, people like James have profited from shame and fear. It ends now." Emily moved fully into the study, standing beside Richard at the window. In the reflection, they made an odd pair, the dying millionaire and the wise beyond her years child. But somehow, they fit. "Claire wants to help too," Emily said softly. "She told me last night at the hospital. She wants to talk to the other mothers, tell them her story, show them they're not alone." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. Claire had spent 15 years running from her past, but now she was choosing to face it head-on, to use her pain to help others. Detective Martinez closed her notebook and stood. "The DA will want to move quickly on this. Once the story fully breaks, there will be no controlling the narrative. Are you all prepared for what's coming?" Richard looked at Emily, seeing in her face the same strength he'd recognized in Sarah, the same determination he was finally seeing in Claire. "We're ready," he said. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As Martinez left, Emily stayed by the window, watching rain begin to fall outside. "Richard," she said suddenly, "are you sick? I've seen the medicine bottles in your bathroom, and sometimes, when you think no one's looking, you look really tired." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Of course she had noticed. She noticed everything. Yes, he said simply, I'm sick, but that's not important right now. Emily turned to face him, her eyes fierce. It is important. Your family now, all of us, you, Claire, Mom, we're finally a real family. You can't... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Richard understood. He knelt down to her level, ignoring the pain in his joints. Emily, listen to me. No matter what happens, you will never be alone again. I promise you that. The hospital corridor was packed with reporters. Despite the security guard's best efforts, news of Sarah's connection to the James Blackwood case had leaked. Now, every media outlet in Boston wanted the exclusive story of the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect a child that wasn't legally hers. Richard guided Emily through the crowd, shielding her from flashing cameras and shouted questions. Claire followed close behind, her face hidden behind large sunglasses. They had developed this routine over the past week, moving as a unit, protecting each other from the constant media onslaught. Sarah was sitting up in bed when they entered her room, looking at a newspaper. Her face was drawn with worry. "They're calling me a kidnapper," she said quietly, showing them the headline. "Some of these articles, they're twisting everything around." "They're wrong," Emily said fiercely, climbing onto the bed beside her. "You saved me. You're my hero." Claire moved to the window, pulling the blinds closed against the telephoto lenses, trying to capture images from the parking lot below. "My family's lawyers are behind this," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They're trying to control the narrative, make it look like you stole Emily instead of protecting her." "Let them try," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We have the evidence, we have the truth, and tomorrow we have the press conference." The press conference had been Richard's idea. Instead of letting the media spin their own versions of events, they would tell the whole story themselves. Sarah, Claire, and 3 other families affected by James's schemes had agreed to speak. They would show the world the real human cost of James's crime. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" Richard asked Sarah gently. The doctors had agreed to discharge her for the event, but she was still weak. Sarah's chin lifted with determination. "I have to be. After 15 years of hiding, it's time to stand up and be counted." A knock at the door made them all tense, but it was only Detective Martinez. She entered quickly, closing the door on the clamoring press outside. "James is trying to make another deal," she said without preamble. "He says he has information about other cases, older ones, but he wants full immunity." "No," Claire's voice was like steel. "No more deals, no more secrets." "The DA agrees," Martinez nodded. "But James's attorney is claiming he was just following orders from his wealthy clients. He's threatening to expose every family he ever worked with." "Let him," Richard said. "The truth needs to come out. All of it." Emily, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Did you find the other babies? The ones like me?" Martinez's expression softened. "Some of them. Many were adopted by loving families who had no idea about James's methods. Others..." She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Others weren't as lucky as Emily," Sarah finished quietly. "That's why we have to do this. For all of them." Richard felt a wave of dizziness, the cancer making itself known. He sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, trying to hide his discomfort. But Emily noticed. She always noticed. "You should be resting," she said, worry clear in her voice. "I'm fine." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired." Claire crossed the room to stand behind his chair, her hand resting on his shoulder. They hadn't told anyone else about his condition yet. There had been too much else happening, too many other crises to manage. "Richard," Martinez said carefully, "the press conference. Are you sure you want to go through with it? Once this story fully breaks, the publicity will be overwhelming." "It already is overwhelming," he gestured toward the door and the reporters beyond it. "At least this way, we control how the truth comes out." Sarah shifted in her bed, wincing slightly. "What about Emily? All this exposure, she's just a child." "I want to do it," Emily said firmly. "I want everyone to know what really happened. Maybe it will help other kids like me." The room fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Outside, they could still hear the muffled sounds of reporters, of cameras clicking, of questions being shouted. The world was waiting for their story. Richard looked at his strange, beautiful family, the wife who had found her courage, the woman who had sacrificed everything for love, and the remarkable child who had brought them all together. Despite his illness, despite the chaos swirling around them, he felt oddly at peace. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we tell the truth, no matter what comes after." Later that night, back at the mansion, Richard found Emily in the garden. She was sitting by the rosebush, the one that hadn't bloomed in years, but had suddenly sprung to life since her arrival. "You should be sleeping," he said, lowering himself carefully onto the bench beside her. "So should you," she countered. "Big day tomorrow." Richard looked up at the stars, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. "Are you scared?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "But Mom, Sarah, she always says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right anyway. She's a wise woman, your mom. I have 2 wise moms now," Emily said thoughtfully, "and you, for as long as—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Richard put his arm around her small shoulders. "Emily, listen to me. What we're doing tomorrow, telling our story, exposing the truth, it's going to help so many people. That's going to be my legacy, making sure you and your mothers are protected, that no one can ever hurt you again." Emily leaned against him, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. 6 months had passed since the press conference. The autumn air was crisp as Richard sat in his favorite garden chair, wrapped in a warm blanket, watching Emily tend to the roses. They were blooming impossibly late in the season, as if defying the approaching winter, just as their caretaker had defied all odds. The press conference had changed everything. Sarah, Claire, and Emily had told their story with dignity and courage. Other families had come forward, each revelation adding to the mountain of evidence against James and his co-conspirators. Claire's family had tried to deny everything, but faced with overwhelming proof, they'd eventually admitted their role. James was serving a 20-year sentence. The foundation Richard had established was helping dozens of families affected by similar schemes, providing support and resources to both birth mothers and adoptive families. Claire had found her voice as an advocate, sharing her story to help other young women facing impossible choices. But the most profound changes had happened within their own family. Sarah had moved into the east wing of the mansion after her recovery, accepting Richard and Claire's insistence that she was family now. Emily flourished with both her mothers present, no longer torn between past and present. The 3 women had formed a bond that transcended traditional family structures, each bringing their own strength to their unusual but loving home. "The white ones are blooming," Emily called out excitedly, pointing to a fresh bud. "Mum said these were your wife's favorites." "They were," Claire said, emerging from the house with a tray of tea. She set it down on the small table beside Richard. "I had almost forgotten about them." Richard watched them together, his wife and their daughter. Claire had changed the most over these months, shedding her society persona like an ill-fitting coat. She was softer now, more present, real. Sarah appeared in the garden doorway, moving slower than before her illness, but with determination. "Emily, don't forget you have homework." "Just 5 more minutes," Emily pleaded, gesturing to the roses. "They're almost ready to bloom." "They'll still be here tomorrow," Richard said quietly. Something in his tone made them all stop. Emily looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the pallor of his skin, the weight he'd lost. The cancer had progressed exactly as the doctors had predicted. His time was growing short. Emily left her roses and came to sit at his feet, leaning against his legs like she had done so many times over these past months. Sarah and Claire drew closer too, forming a protective circle around him. "I need to tell you all something," Richard said, his voice weak but clear. The foundation is secure. Everything has been arranged. Emily will have her trust fund, the one she should have had all along, plus interest. Sarah, the East Wing is yours, legally. And Claire, don't, Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please, Claire, he continued gently, you've become the woman I always knew you could be. Strong, brave, a real mother. Promise me you'll keep fighting for what's right. I promise, she managed through her tears. Emily gripped his hand tightly. You can't go. We need you. Richard squeezed her hand back with what strength he had left. You don't need me anymore, sweetheart. You have your mothers, both of them. You have a home, a future. My job here is done. Sarah moved forward, taking his other hand. You gave us everything. No. Richard shook his head slowly. You gave me everything. You showed me what real love looks like, what real courage is. I was just lucky enough to be part of your story. A white rose petal drifted down, landing on Emily's dark hair. She reached up to touch it, then looked at Richard with those wise eyes that had first caught his attention on that rainy day that seemed so long ago now. You're our miracle, she said simply. You found us when we were lost. Richard smiled, feeling a deep peace settle over him. Sometimes, he said softly, the best families are the ones we choose, the ones we build together out of love and truth and courage. They sat there in the garden as the sun began to set, the roses releasing their sweet fragrance into the cooling air. No more words were needed. They had found each other, healed each other, become something greater than the sum of their broken parts. 2 weeks later, they buried Richard in a quiet ceremony. Emily planted white roses on his grave, the same variety that had bloomed so impossibly late in their garden. Claire and Sarah stood on either side of her, their hands linked together, a chain of love and support that would never be broken. The headlines had called their story a scandal, a tragedy, a cautionary tale. But they knew better. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, of love transcending biology and social conventions. It was the story of a man who in his final months had found something more precious than all his wealth, a family built on truth and courage rather than lies and fear. As they left the cemetery, Emily looked back one last time. The setting sun caught the white rose petals, making them glow like stars fallen to earth. He'll always be with us, she said confidently, in the roses, in our hearts, in the family we've become. Claire and Sarah each took one of her hands, and together they walked toward their future, a future Richard had helped build, where love knew no boundaries and family meant more than blood. The white roses bloomed in their garden every year after that, long past their natural season, as if keeping a promise that love, real love, could overcome any obstacle, heal any wound, and build bridges across the deepest divides. It was Richard's final gift to them, the understanding that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all, but about the families we choose, the truths we face, and the courage to begin again.